We stood on the upper deck, which served as a roof for the little cabin, and, peering into the darkness, we saw only the flashes of gunshots on the shore, and high in the sky, the soundless bursts of shells. The wind was blowing from the sea, and the waves were crashing against the flat sides of our little landing craft, kicking up fine water dust into the air. The wind roared incessantly. It allowed no other sounds to penetrate. The roar of wind and water and the deafening clatter of the diesels down there filled everything. The first flying fortress, that was covered with fire, flew a torch through the intermittent flashes of bursting shells, drawing a long trail of fire across the sky, smooth straight, then, having described a soft curve, it, falling, curved it, and went steeply downward, and the trail of fire, rippling, stretched after it almost plumb from the sky to the ground. In the light of the explosion, as the airplane crashed to the ground, we saw France for the first time. The explosion whipped a huge yellow-orange flame toward the sky, and it spread out as symmetrically as the curve the airplane had described as it fell. The flame rose in an even dome, dark at the base, and the higher in circumference, the brighter. It was very, very bright, and apparently the explosion had occurred at some distance from the shore, for in its light the irregular outlines of land and a vessel in the coastal waters far ahead of us appeared. This did not last long, and after all was extinguished, the intermittent flashes of the guns of the shore batteries and shells again flashed before us, which, reaching a certain distance, burst all at the same altitude. There were no lights on the 105-foot landing craft ahead of us, nor was there any on the one whose bow jerked and swayed only a few yards from our stern, where we stood over the navigator's cabin. We were now scarcely moving. It was 5:30 in the morning of June 6. The second, followed by the third fortresses, flew down, flaring up like the first. They first described a smooth curve, then fell steeply and exploded. When the bombs fell from the fortress, while it was still in the air, they seemed to cut huge holes in the darkness and illuminated the horizon with jagged, angry flashes. But it was neither as beautiful nor as ominous as the explosion of the flying fortress as it crashed to the ground. We were very, very cold, and I couldn't tell if the cold was coming from outside or inside myself. We had been on the landing craft for 3 days and 2 nights now, and the fear had manifested itself in such innumerable varied forms that we had grown bored with it, and had even ceased to be interested in its signs. On the first day, when we thought we were really going into business, we talked about it, and we were all so absorbed in the fact that sometimes our throats would dry up and our breath would be taken away by our own sensations, and we would only wake up when we saw that a man was talking, but you could not hear him. And it also seemed to me that fear, just naked fear, fear that you can't do anything about, made most people drowsy. They would sit down in a corner somewhere or stretch out under the tanks and sleep and sleep and sleep, as if trying to escape from a reality in which everything that could be done had already been done, and now there was nothing left to do but sit and float to where death awaited you. The little lieutenant from Brooklyn who commanded the bomb platoon, and this platoon was to land to remove some underwater obstructions, was fantasizing aloud. He leaned on the railing and said, "Don't you think there might be an armistice now, and we haven't been told about it? Ah, what do you suppose? Think how funny that would be. It's all over now, and we don't know anything here." Several times a day I heard him tell this to one and another. He liked the idea, and his face grew lively when he spoke of it. It seemed to encourage him. The tankers were mostly silent. They were very attentive to each other in little things, like finding a place and pulling up tarps to protect themselves from the incessant rain and spraying foam. They gathered around the little aluminum stoves that tank crews use, helped each other make coffee in big tins, or heated up something from their 10 rations. And we had so many of these rations on board that we could feed 3 times as many men as the 1/3 of the tank unit and the sapper platoon that was travelling with us. We had 6 tanks on board. The rest of the tank unit went on ships ahead and behind us. We came down from the Devonshire hills on Saturday afternoon and loaded in a small bay below Dartmouth. We anchored all night, a few hundred yards from the loading point. As far as we could make out from the highest point on our boat, the whole bay was packed with other vessels of all sizes, from a small passenger boat to large landing craft with infantry and tanks, which seemed to us as huge as ocean-going line ships. On Sunday morning, we dropped anchor. We went out into the sea through a narrow channel and sailed along the shore where the inhabitants were enjoying their Sunday vacation, swimming or snacking on the beach. We swam within shouting distance of them, but they didn't even look at us or wave at us. They were locals who had come to relax. This whole coast has long been closed to tourists from the north, and the locals had gotten used to it, having watched the same caravans of ships passing through and then coming back from maneuvers for months. Obviously, it never occurred to them that these were troops that would be leaving, but certainly not coming back. All that Sunday we pushed on in the channel, which at first was light grey and then grew darker and darker as the sky darkened and the morning sun was covered with clouds. The clouds crowded in and descended lower and lower towards the sea. We could see neither the end nor the beginning of our caravan, and on the horizon, on either side, we could hardly distinguish points on the horizon that were also caravans of ships, and they too had neither end nor beginning. The cabin of our vessel contained 2 bunks and a table. The skipper, an Englishman 21 years of age, and his chief mate, an Australian 20 years of age, were placed in it. They invited the colonel and myself to share their cabin, and when a tall, rustic little fellow, a sailor of the ship's crew, brought a pot of tea from the galley, we were also served mugs. We opened tins of bacon and jam, took sugar and coffee with condensed milk out of our rations, and busied ourselves with cooking on the little gasoline stove I had placed on the cabin table. When the table was cleared away, Colonel Ruff and I spread out on the table maps of the little section of Normandy which was now to be our world, and began to play at soldiering. We were deciding with importance which roads we would take and charting the route, realizing at the same time that as soon as we got ashore we would take any road or field just so long as we moved in a given direction. We had only one task, and that was to move our tanks 7 or 8 miles inland from the shore on the day of the invasion to the place where the more northerly of our 2 American airborne troops would land. There was such a mountainous area there, west of the town of St. Mere-Église. The first day we didn't feel much fear because we were still living the bustle of preparations, sending our tanks to the coast and loading. It seemed to us then that it would all happen very quickly. Here we'll pass this day and then the night at sea, and the next morning will already be the landing. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the first day, Sunday, our young skipper came and announced to us that we were turning. He shrugged his shoulders. He did not know whether it was a temporary change of course, to avoid some enemy manoeuvre, or really a change of plan. He was to follow the stern of the vessel ahead, and following him we were now heading back towards England. The foul weather grew heavier, the rain increased in frequency and at times turned to a downpour. Toward evening we learned that there would be no landing the next day. For all this time we had been heading north, first on one course, then on another. Just before dark, we came upon a large cluster of vessels, which, swaying, stood or slowly circled in place. In the distance land was visible. Among these small vessels we saw a large warship looming above them. It stood at anchor. Our vessel went slowly to the anchorage, and then we too anchored, for how long is unknown. At night, left to ourselves, we began to relive the whole thing again, and this is where I think fear took hold of us. We could count on our fingers all the things that could happen to us, and there was nothing we could do about any of them. We could be threatened by the enemy's torpedo boats, which had sunk our landing craft on manoeuvres a month before, and that was no farther off the coast of England than we were standing now. It was conceivable that the Germans would risk launching submarines into the Channel as well, if they had intelligence that invasion vessels had arrived here. There could have been mines. But the most frightening thing about a crossing like ours was the air. No cover could secure the air over the Channel, and the long rows of our landing craft were here real targets in a shooting gallery. Moving in a caravan, we were making 6 knots. At most we could make 8. On the opposite shore there were underwater barrages, coastal batteries. It seemed to me that I remembered by heart how they were located. But worst of all for us was that damned coastal sandbank with the flooded space behind it. The closest shoal to Saint Mere-Église was near the town of Saint Martin de Baville. This was the invasion site, Utah. The whole difficulty of landing at the Utah site was that this shoal was a narrow ridge of sand, beyond which the ground dropped several feet at a time. In ordinary times the sand ridge held back the sea waters, and beyond it lay the meadows where the cattle grazed. But now these meadows on our aerial photographs glistened with water. The Germans had flooded them, and they were a lagoon 2 miles wide. Having landed on the Utah, the first echelon of the invasion force was to seize the concrete machine gun nests in the dunes along the shore, and then the amphibious tanks and infantry chest deep in water, were to cross the lagoon and climb the slopes of the hills on the other side. These slopes behind the Utah dominated the lagoon and the coastal shoal. There were artillery guns and machine guns and, in all probability, rocket launchers. All the way from the sandbank across the lagoon and along the hillsides, several miles inland, were minefields. There would be no time to secure them. And yet, however, the worst thing about Utah was still this narrow sandbank. The invasion transports would inevitably form a solid jam here when they landed, a jam that we had foreseen and had to put up with. The crews of each tank squadron were to linger here and clean the engines and all working parts of the vehicles of safety anti-corrosion grease. Then most of them had to wait for the sapper units to make a path across the lagoon, so that the tanks one by one could cross over to solid ground. There was no way to avoid this congestion when making the plan of action, because it was impossible to ferry all the vehicles needed to attack the shore without them huddling here on this narrow sandbank. We had to accept the inevitable losses in advance and have enough vehicles ready by the time it would be possible to start crossing the lagoon. The amphibious tanks, if they lived up to our hopes, could cross the lagoon by themselves. Perhaps the infantry could also cross, from our aerial photographs, and even from the first-hand reports we received from our comrades on the French shore, it was extremely difficult to ascertain with absolute accuracy whether the depth in the flooded area reached 3 feet or 6 feet. These doubtful 3 feet, however, in this case might have proved fatal to the infantry. From the point of view of a man who had participated in such operations and who knew what artillery training was all about, the Utah represented an excellent coast. It lies north of the coastal bend where the Cotentin Peninsula elbows into the waters of the English Channel. To the south, well above the forearm of this elbow, stick out like biceps steep rocky hills. On the tops of these hills, they are very picturesque on aerial photographs when you look at them with a magnifying glass. You could see through the foliage of trees long rows of artillery barrels transferred here from the Maginot Line. They were 10-inch guns, and behind them was a shelter where the artillerymen were entrenched. Fruit trees were visible behind this shelter. The guns were set up here for the defense of the Utah sector. They were lined up in rows at right angles to crossfire the Utah from one end to the other. On the sandbank, where the transports were caught in the jam under the mounted fire of the 10-inch guns, and under the hillsides on the other side of the lagoon, there was decidedly no cover except for concrete machine gun nests built by human hands and dug at unequal intervals deep into the dunes. An expert artilleryman had drawn little curves on our maps, which showed how the fire of the guns of the German defences would overlap here. There were not many areas on the shoal where only 2 of all the 88 mm guns could fire on us at a time. There were 88 mm guns at close range, which were direct fire, then 88 mm guns at the foot of the hills, direct and indirect fire, then, there at the foot of the hills, mortars, and finally, on the tops, 10-inch guns from the Maginot Line. But what was the use of counting machine gun nests or speculating about how the Germans could reinforce the coastal defences with troops and guns, which, according to our air reconnaissance, had been delivered here a week before and were being unloaded from trains all over the peninsula? And that's where it got unbearable when one tried to imagine what it would all look like. It was something like the maze in the Sunday supplement to the newspaper when you were a kid trying to figure it out. There was no decisive way to pencil your way through all the confusion and get out safely on the other side. And just like a child who gets tired of struggling with a difficult task, each of us got tired of it and wanted to throw this picture and stop thinking about it. There is no way out of this labyrinth, that's all. It was like that when we started to think about it, and then there was a feeling of emptiness, and it just felt so uncomfortable. We talked, but it was as if no one was talking or hearing anything. We were hungry, and we had all kinds of food, but the food wouldn't go down our throats. And there was nothing else to do but go out on deck and gawk at the big caravan moving slowly southward. Or one could go downstairs and snuggle in a corner and doze off and maybe see something pleasant in one's sleep. As we crossed the channel for the second time, I was reading Storm in Jamaica. I pictured those children very vividly and thought a lot about them. When the second night came, we all had the feeling that we had slept too much the last 2 days. Either because France was now very near, or it was very cold, and we were all just shivering. In short, we were no longer able to sleep. All night long, we watched from the deck the slow movement of the caravan. There was some light visible in the sky behind the clouds all night long, and as the squadron of cruisers cut through our caravan at right angles heading westward, each cruiser seemed larger than the Rock of Gibraltar. They passed through the caravan at 15 to 20 knots. Indestructible, without a single fire. The small landing craft were diving, spinning, being swept aside by the huge bow waves of the cruisers, thrown away by the rushing stream. The cruisers seemed ominous hulks in the darkness. What had it cost these steel-nosed monsters to sink several small landing craft in order to accomplish their terrible task in time to get to where they were supposed to be? Edson Ruff was a calm man, and nothing seemed to perturb his calmness until the planes returning from a parachute landing operation appeared above us, straggling away from the formation. We had, of course, perfectly accurate information about the landing site of the parachute division we were to join. The big air squadron which was to bring it to the spot was holding a course north of ours. Having dropped the troops, it was to turn back and fly directly over our caravan, or at least pass so low over us that we could hear the rumble of the engines. It seemed to be about 3 o'clock when the first plane flew over. This C-47 was flying solo, tilting and diving, apparently trying to see what was being done on the water and at the same time not to hit a wave. Following the first airplane, 2 more flew by, then another, and that was it. It didn't work, Edson said. What didn't work? I asked. I think they were killed, he said. Something happened, in a word. They should have been flying in hundreds in formation if the landing had gone well, and they're flying separately. It didn't work out. That's what happened. We stood there staring into the darkness. What do we do now, Master? We asked. All we can do is move to where they were supposed to be dropped, Edson muttered. About a dozen more planes appeared from somewhere in the darkness and swooped over us, darting and diving like the previous ones. After that, none more appeared. It was not until we saw the flashing of guns on the shore that we realized that we had come up to land. The time was 5:30, and the flying fortresses appeared in the sky. They bombed for a long time and probably came more than once in big waves. The explosions of their bombs flashed and went out like fire in the steppe. But the guns on the shore were firing without ceasing, and now and then one of the bombers would crash to the ground. When the bombardment ceased, no fire was visible on the land and nothing was blazing, contrary to what was said in our communiques, which asserted that, after the flying fortresses dropped their bombs on a city, there were fires. There were no cities where the flying fortresses dropped their bombs. Just sand dunes, fields, farmers' houses, and concrete nests, so small that they could hardly be seen from the air even in bright sunlight. We did not consider how many machine gun nests had been destroyed by the first bombing. Now it was all over, and all first to last was accomplished silently, for the wind drowned out all sound with its roar. When the artillery of the battleships entered, the flame of the inboard guns seemed to us even more beautiful than the flaring fortresses, when, crashing to the ground, they swept upward in a fiery ring of blazing gasoline. The battleships were nearer to us, and the flames of their shots were lighter and brighter. One group of these ships was to our right, another closer to the curve of the shore on our port side. They beat and beat, and we were relieved, though we could not match the flashes on the shore with their firing, for the shells of these guns, when they burst, did not flash so brightly as the bombs dropped from the flying fortresses. We stood with Edson Ruff on the cabin roof and looked down at the tethered tanks in the open hold. The little lieutenant from Brooklyn was checking the gear of his subordinates. They stood 2 by 2, 3 by 3, with explosive charges on their belts and in their bags. Throughout our long journey, we had been towed by a small 40-foot landing craft, which was pulling behind us, swaying on the end of a heavy steel cable. We were to arrive at the starting line an hour ahead of the first assault echelons and ferry the sappers aboard the LCM. They were to ride it forward and find the steel rails that the Germans had buried in the sand. It was not difficult to find them, as it was low tide and they were sticking out of the water. It was necessary to tie explosive charges to them and blow them up to pave the way for the landing craft with infantry. 3 or 4 times the LCM's tow rope broke, and there was a commotion. To retrieve it, we had to wait for them to start their own engines, pass near us, and lift the tow rope on the line. Other small landing craft crossed the channel using their own engines. They came in large, close packs, like bunches of pods floating on the water. Our LCM was going in tow to conserve fuel for its early morning operations, but even a few hours before the sappers moved on it. The cable broke for the last time, and the little craft had to end the trip willy-nilly on its own. The crews of our tanks looked silently at the preparations of the sappers. They all moved aside to make room for the sappers. The sappers were guests of the tankers, and not very welcome guests, for their baggage consisted of strong explosives which any tracer bullet could detonate. But now, at this moment, they were masters of the ship. They were the most important. They were the men who had to get off on enemy soil before we got off. The patrol boat drew nearer to us, blasting white, clawing foam with its bow. Someone was on the bridge, cursing us in a horn. "Get that crew the hell out of here. Get them the hell out of here. Get them the hell out of here." The lieutenant looked down at me with sad eyes and spread his hands helplessly. "He's yelling for me to get them out quick," he shouted to me, and I lost my sergeant just before we sailed. "How can I get them off as soon as possible?" The replacement sergeant shoveled the sappers' belongings in armfuls and pushed them to the rail. They reluctantly climbed aboard, grasped a hand extended from a neighbouring deck, and jumped as the ships bumped and shuddered and drew apart again. The sergeant could not get them to drag the explosives as fast as he wished, and began to throw them from one vessel to another. Then one of the sappers, who had already moved to the smaller vessel, suddenly realized that he had forgotten something, and one, then another jumped back under the temporary protection of our vessel. The man on the patrol boat continued to shout into the horn, "Get them out," but the boat had already been carried away by the wind or current and was now barely audible. The lieutenant patted the last of his men on the back, then pushed the whole bunch to the railing at the side, watched them jump over one by one, turned around, waved us up to the bridge, and jumped over himself. The ropes were removed. The wave swept up the little craft, and it rushed sideways away from us. But then the engines rumbled. White foam boiled up from under the stern, and the ship ran toward the shore. The sappers disappeared. The sky had already turned a little greyer, and one could distinguish the outlines of the low shore, and in this grey haze the flashes began to flash again. They were not so bright now, but there were no airplanes above us. Shells were being fired at our ships and at the battleships, but we neither heard nor saw a single shell. Our turn was scheduled to come in 5 hours. We had landed the sappers 2 miles offshore. Now we slowly turned back and headed toward where the transports behind us were already approaching and beginning to unload. The first assault echelons overtook us as we turned. They were coming in vessels exactly like those with which we had spent those days in the Channel. We were not going at such a close distance from them that we could see the men. They just passed by, getting farther away, getting smaller and smaller, and finally disappearing altogether into the grey gloom of the sea and the same grey, only slightly deeper gloom of the shore. No matter how hard we tried to look through our binoculars, we could not see what happened to them after they came ashore. The same incessant volleys flashed on the shore, but they told us nothing, and not a single sound reached us through the roar of the wind. The sappers had disappeared. The first assault echelons also disappeared. The day had come. Far in the distance the shore was whitening, and beyond it the land was blackening. Through binoculars we could see the silhouettes of trees and even the spire of the bell tower. We went down from the deck to a small deckhouse where the helm and compass were placed. In the corner of this tiny bridge was the radio station. The radio operator was listening into headphones. When he saw us, he turned a lever, and from a hole in the grey metal came a voice. It spoke very clearly, in perfect English with an Oxford accent. He said, "There is monstrous confusion on shore. Anglo-American landings have been thrown into the sea. Negro cokes are grasping their guns and trying to cover the retreat of the assault troops. The sight is beyond description. Everyone is running in panic and throwing themselves into the sea. Casualties." The radio operator chuckled, but it didn't seem so funny to us. From the deck of our LCS, although France was only a few hundred yards away, it was impossible to make out exactly what was going on. The people on the shoal seemed like tiny black figures against the white background of the sand. The sand between them flew up in little fountains, and the black figures seemed to dance around these fountains. From time to time a small car would jump out of some landing craft of the first batch of transports that came up before us, jumped out and began to crawl very slowly through these fountains. And then suddenly it would either stop on the spot or go over the dunes and disappear. We were on one of the ships of a much-stretched flotilla, just like ours, dirty white in this morning sunlight. We were all moving in an even keel very, very slowly. The disembarkation points were all full by now, and noon had not yet come. The water in the shallows was calm, and the line of warships still firing were far behind us, almost on the horizon. Above us in scattered formation flew fighters, 2 at a time, 4 at a time. They were not firing, and no one was firing at them. But far beyond the shoreline a shroud of grey-white haze was spreading across the sky, and just above it, sparkling through it like stardust, fire sparkles flashed here and there. They testified that bombers were operating there. As we approached the shore, we heard for some time the deafening booms of the battleship's guns. But now our own tanks in the hold below us were starting their engines, and only this noise was in our ears. We watched, and, hearing nothing through the noise, were unable to understand anything in the strange confusion that was going on around us. The little troop ship, full of men, which had come alongside of us, rose smoothly into the air, tilted with majestic slowness, lay on its side, and finally turned over, plunging its open mouth full of men directly into the water, which immediately closed up, leaving only a thin strip of keel sticking out. The fountains that surged ashore moved toward us. High crests of white and grey water surged and fell. A small boat, pushing away from the shore, went straight toward us. It passed quite close by. We peered into it and saw the wounded on the bottom, some of them squirming, others lying motionless. The 2 landing craft ahead of us had already unloaded, and now there was only a small strip of water between us and the land. The young skipper sick. Well, now it's our turn, and the old shabby craft seemed to pull up and rush toward land. Close up we saw that the people around the sand fountains on the shoal seemed to be playing with them. They were running between them, throwing themselves on the ground, twitching, twirling. One of them, when we were quite near the shore, stopped right beside such a fountain and turned over twice on the spot, throwing up his hands. All this we saw, as in a dream, from the deck. When the second vessel on our right flew up into the air and overturned and crashed into the water around us boiled, and all the experiences of the night, the explosions of the huge flying fortresses falling to the ground and engulfed in flames, the horizon ablaze with the cold flashes of battleships, the furious wind and waves, all this came together, and I felt like that little girl from Storm in Jamaica. I experienced an earthquake. This experience of mine cannot be compared in any way to the experiences of others, for it was my earthquake. When we approached and lowered the gangway, this childish surprise disappeared. From that moment, everything became extremely prosaic. The Colonel and I had one armoured jeep for two, with a quarter-inch thick sheet of steel instead of a windshield, and a 5-shot machine gun on a machine behind the two front seats. We had a chauffeur and a machine gunner with us. We didn't want to risk trusting this car on the shoal, so we hitched it to our last tank to pull it ashore. The Colonel sat on the back of the first tank, and I climbed on the back of the last tank, the same one the jeep was towing. We did this in case something happened to one of us. We had a spot marked on our map, just beyond the first ridge of dunes, where we were to link up with the tanks of the other landing craft. Our motorcycle platoon and the glider infantry, who were to be loaded onto the tanks, were to meet us there as well. Our skipper had secured the landing very well. The skippers of landing craft are divided into good and bad skippers with respect to their passengers. The bad ones lead their craft hesitantly and become in deep water. Our skipper turned out to be a good skipper. He was not afraid to crash into the sand and brought his vessel right up to dry land. Our big tanks only splashed a little, sliding down the gangway to the shore. Our vessel began to bow directly against the gash in the dunes where the road ran. Majestically, one by one, the first 5 tanks dived nose forward, descending the gangway, swaying and tumbling, went over the water, passed over the dune, disappeared from sight. Halfway down, in the very middle of the shoal, my 6th tank, dragging the jeep behind it, suddenly stopped and hesitated. Sitting on the armour while it still crawled up the ramp, I took a quick look around the shore. Most of these sand fountains had arisen, as far as I could make out, from mortar fire. The mines were falling just a little to the left of where we had to pass. It was clear that the first mine, which would fall a little to the right, would hit just in the tail of the tank. At the very minute when the tank stopped, somewhere there at the foot of the hills, changed the sight, and the mines began to fall further, flying over us. Then I remember flying off my shaking steel perch, thrown off by the blast wave, and falling into the sand behind the tank, near a jeep tied in tow. Someone in the jeep was hit by something that sent me flying. But it turned out to be a minor abrasion, and all 3 of us rushed to the cable to unhitch the car. When we finally got it unhooked, I sent it forward toward the Colonel and started banging on the metal sides of the tank to get the driver to look back at me. We were standing right in the very middle of the only road that led from the coast, and the whole avalanche of invasion seemed to be thundering behind us, or bursting from the side, rushing after our vehicle. The men ran clumsily along the shoal, tumbling heavily under the weight of their equipment and the fact that their feet were stuck in the sand. We were all wearing large, flat, round gut-like rubber life belts under our armpits and around our torsos. The damn driver couldn't hear me from deep inside the tank. The tank was sealed shut. There was no way to shout to him inside. The shells were falling, then not reaching us, then flying over our heads and kicking up fountains of sand. Then suddenly there was a thin, high, piercing sound, and I only then realized that it was the charge of an 88 mm gun. I realized it later, because if you happen to hear it very close, then neither think nor remember what it is. You do not have to. Usually you are on the ground before you can think of anything, because the instinctive movement to hide is so lightning fast. But it must have travelled somewhere very far away, for I cannot remember whether I heard it explode or not. Then followed a few horrible minutes. I jumped up and started bludgeoning the tank, then dived into the sand again hearing the same sound. No one was running past any more. Everything went quiet on the shoal around. Everyone was lying down. The only thing I realized was that as long as my tank was stuck here, the gun would keep firing until it hit it. I climbed up on the front of the tank and started pounding on the armored glass at the driver's door. The hatch opened hesitantly, and out popped a head in a soccer helmet. I yelled in her ear, "Get the hell out of here." The head disappeared. The hatch closed, and finally, we moved. We crawled over the dune. Under the shelter of the dune on the seaside, A long line of men were rummaging in the sand, trying to make some sort of trench. I sat majestically on the back of my tank, but I had no control over it. It moved along the tracks ahead, then suddenly the driver turned abruptly and drove along the inner edge of the dune. There were no more sand fountains here. To my left lay the lagoon I had thought so much about. The water stood still and silent. Beyond it rose sloping hills clothed with lush green, with clumps of trees among the meadows and forest looming on the horizon. In the distance, at a distance of 1 or 2 miles, rose above the trees the lonely bell tower I had seen from the sea. As we descended 100 yards along the shore of the lagoon, we suddenly came upon other tanks. Their hatches were open, and the tankers were standing side by side, pulling off their big pneumatic cylinders, which stuck out of their backs like tourniquets. These cylinders formed part of our waterproof equipment. The colonel, the tank commander, and a few sergeants stood around and chuckled. As I slid off the top and joined them, my driver friend turned the tank around abruptly and crushed a 5-gallon tin of engine oil that had been removed from another tank. I was doused from head to toe with black, oily slop. It dripped out of my ears and down my nose. Everyone was watching and laughing. We were very happy to be standing here on the sunny shore, and it was all so easy. It all turned out to be so easy because there was a mistake. And, as far as I know, the only one in the whole landing, a navigational error. The road from the shore by which we passed over the ridge of dunes had not been taken into account in making the landing plan, because it was too exposed, and it was doubtful whether it was usable. It was safe to say that it was a trap with wire barriers, mines, and other surprises. The landing had been planned north of the road, but owing to a perfectly negligible error on the day of the invasion, the entire landing site was moved a few hundred yards south of what was intended. Thus our landing site, marked on the map in the red Utah section of the map, came just opposite that road. The first vehicles went straight down this road. The Germans had not mined or guarded it. Obviously, it was an exit to the sea left for the population. This miracle number 1 was followed by miracle number 2. On the other side of the dune, against this passage from the shore, was built for 2 miles the only artificial road through the flooded space inland. This road could be seen on our aerial photographs. But no one in making the plan of invasion dared to expect that this road would survive the landing of the first troops, for it was so easily destroyed. Even if it were not mined, a single shell from a field gun would be enough to tear it up and render it utterly unusable. On this morning, however, the day of the invasion, this carpet leading to the paradise of the mainland was, in pristine, untouched condition, apparently too. This road had been left either for the needs of the local population or to supply the German machine gun nests on the shoal. Half an hour later, when we, having cleaned our tanks of the protective thick grease, moved in column across this planking, no one had even fired a single shot at us. We heard the guns at the foot of the hills, their shells flying over us, fell on the bank. But no German commander bothered to fire on this precious passage. After driving a little way, we found that a small group of Germans were trying to stop the first of the amphibious tanks that had gone at them as early as dawn. Their corpses were lying in the mud at the edge of the road or sticking out of the water near the bank. The road was very narrow, and there were 2 turns on it. One American amphibious tank slid into the water at one of the turns and stood submerged almost halfway down. It appeared to be undamaged, but the crew abandoned it and moved on foot. We did not see a single American killed, and meanwhile we were climbing the hillsides at the rate of 10 miles an hour. The time was nearing noon, and so far no trouble was in sight. We were now very close to the spot from which the German guns were beating on the shore, but we had been ordered not to stop or look for them, but to keep away from them. Somewhere among these hills were American airborne troops, and it was very important for them, if they were not killed in the dropping, to get our tanks fully intact. By the time we reached the bell tower, which I'd noticed from our ship, the top of it had already been knocked off by something. It stood in the middle of a small village square, and then I saw an absolutely astonishing sight. On the edge of the road that circled the square on a corner lay the corpse of a German soldier. He had been run over so many times by the tracks of the tanks that he was completely flat, like a cut-out picture, literally completely flat. The sleeves of his grey uniform were spread crosswise, his black boots and the feet in them were so flat and thin as if they had been cut out of a piece of dirty cardboard. In the square stood a military policeman from the infantry regiment that had landed before us. Without waiting for our question, he pointed directly to a passage. Beyond the passage was an open road, and we rumbled on again and rode into the interior of France. It seemed to me that I recognized this road. In a few miles there must be a crossroads, and a turn to the right would take us to Sainte-Mère-Église. We met neither friends nor foes until this crossroads. Then just over the pass, under the steep crest of the hill, we saw a solitary American tank. Its crew was sitting beside it on the road. The colonel and I were now riding in our car. We separated from the column and drove up to the tank. The tank commander told us that they had landed 2 hours ago, that when they got here some infantrymen told them to stop. There's something like that over the hill. We asked what it was. The sergeant shrugged his shoulders. He replied that the infantry had left, but that his lieutenant had shown up here later and went to look over the area. He had been shot at and told the sergeant to wait here until someone else showed up. While we were talking, our own tanks came up and stopped on either side of the road at an equal distance from each other, like a training ground. The three-axis armoured vehicles of the reconnaissance platoon stopped behind us. It was a very pleasant morning. The sun was shining, small white clouds floated across the sky. Everything was so peaceful, everything was green all round. Colonel Ruff and I climbed to the top of the hill and looked through binoculars at the opposite ridge. The road went straight north. We could see the rooftops of the town of Sainte-Mère-Église around the second bend in the road. Our reconnaissance platoon commander was a jovial young man in his early 20s. He asked the tankers if they realized that his reconnaissance vehicle was the first American vehicle to break into a European fortress. Ruff beckoned him over and said, "They can come on down and see what's going on down there." The lieutenant got into the first vehicle and drove down the road. The tank engines were silent. The rubber tires of the reconnaissance armoured car rustled on the tear of the highway. He went down the opposite slope a little way and stopped to look around. Ruff called out to a sergeant from one of our tanks standing closer to him. "Edge, right behind him, you cover him," he said. The tankers sat down and started the engine. The huge steel hump of the tank over the crest of the hill and drove very close to the reconnaissance vehicle. It moved on, and together they began to descend into the valley. The road, if you looked at it as we did, from the side made a perfectly regular U across the valley. As both cars descended into the arc of this U, two explosions rang out one after the other. PA, standing on the crest of the hill, saw men jump out of the tank and out of the car and rush into the ditch to the right. Then everything went quiet again. Not a single vehicle made a sound or moved, and nothing happened. What followed could be called a comedy that ended tragically. The reconnaissance vehicle and tank that we sent forward were indeed fired upon, but were not damaged. And the rumble we heard was because the reconnaissance vehicle, suddenly backing up, collided with the tank. Both crews thought that the car was hit by a shell and hid in a ditch. The first to escape was a terrified machine gunner from the tank, who had been crawling along the ditch all the way back. He said that he was the only one left alive. 5 minutes later, a scout lieutenant who had been going around through the field appeared. He confusedly explained what had really happened. He had lingered near the car to find out where the shots had come from, but had discovered nothing. Convinced that we were dealing with very heightened nervousness, we decided to send another tank forward, ordering it not to return until it had located the enemy. The tank set off, past the halted vehicles, and no sooner had it made 100 yards afterward than it was hit by some apparently rather large shell, from which it instantly burst into flames. Of the crew there were 3 survivors. Edson, Ruff and I half descended the hill, trying to see the opposite ridge through binoculars, but could not detect any gun barrels there. Whatever it was perfectly concealed and held us under fire. I climbed back up our hill and saw a straggling battery of short-barreled 75 mm howitzer guns that had just come in from the beach. The brave young lieutenant, its commander, was very anxious to get his guns into action as soon as possible, and apparently had no other orders than to bail out when needed. We sent him into the field to the left of the road. I told him to try to knock down the hedges at the corners near the road, at the point where it turned onto the opposite slope behind the burning tank. It was not an easy task for such a gun, and he shelled all those corners in turn. But when we sent a third tank to drag off a stuck comrade, it too came under fire and went back. This time we could quite confidently tell, from the sound, that it was an 88 mm gun, and it was clear that it was standing off to the side of the road. Up to now we had been confused by the echoes echoing through the valley. It was not in the plan for our little Special Forces unit to get into a fight, but apparently we had no way to advance past these guns without first destroying the obstacle lurking on the hill blocking our way. We still had no information about where and when the 82nd Parachute Division landed. Until we knew this for sure, we could only assume that it was where it was supposed to be, that is, about 2 miles from where we were. Our infantry was nowhere to be seen. We must have either overtaken the assault echelons or they had turned somewhere along the coast instead of going inland. We had 17 tanks, 2 reconnaissance vehicles and about 100 glider infantrymen and a 4-gun howitzer battery joining us. So we decided to give a small battle ourselves. Ruff ordered the tank company commander to fan the vehicles on either side of the road, put infantry on them, and move forward from field to field. I helped direct the fire of the howitzers. It was well past noon. Barely had our tanks pulled away when the scouts of the infantry regiment that had landed after us appeared. Behind them, stretching in a long column on both sides of the road, moved American infantry. The regimental commander had stopped at some farm near a crossroads, and he had managed to get in touch with someone by radio. For when Edson and I reported to him, he gave us the first news. Things were going fine on our section of the coast, but on the Omaha section ours was still treading on the shoal and got into a terrible mess. They ran into underwater rocks there, got caught in the rough surf, and 25 of the 27 amphibious tanks launched sank one after another, along with the crews crammed into them. And sappers and infantry without tanks, which covered them, found themselves in a very difficult situation on the shore. Well, what did the infantry colonel intend to do? Would he take the battle we had undertaken and let us get to the other side by some other road? No, that was not part of his mission. He had orders to halt behind the crossroads. Meanwhile, the commander of the 82nd Parachute Division was on his way up the mountain. Ruff stayed at the command post to convince the communications people to make an attempt to connect us with the airborne division so that we could know exactly where to go. And I drove the car back and forth from here to our own command post, which was just a place on the edge of the road, halfway down the hill, where we left our sergeant to wait for us. Our only means of communication was the radio on the Jeep. We were supposed to use it to keep in touch with our tank company and our reconnaissance platoon. The radio operator was huffing and puffing, trying to contact one or the other, and sometimes he managed to catch for a second familiar call signs, but nothing else could be achieved. I would jump out of the car, run into the field, hide behind hedges, and look for the person I needed to talk to. On my second trip back to the crest of the hill, I found our tanks lined up behind a thick tree fence, firing through it on the opposite slope. We now had only 15 tanks left. 2 more tanks, while trying to move further up the field, were hit. We managed to locate one enemy gun sheltered on the opposite edge of the field, but it was impossible to pinpoint its exact location because it was firing very sparingly and only for certain. It was clear that we could not move on until we got it out of the way. I sent gliding infantrymen there. I had at my disposal a telephone cable from the howitzers to the point where we were, and I endeavoured to assist the lieutenant in correcting the fire. About the third shell, after we had established communication, finally hit the target. Apparently we hit some sort of ammunition depot because a solid fountain of fireworks went off in the woods against us. I ordered the lieutenant to continue, and I went to report back to Ruff. On the way back, our radio suddenly came on. It was one of our tanks on the other side of the road. Even through the receiver, you could hear the tension in the voice of the speaker. He was saying, "We have some seriously wounded here. Can't someone be sent here? We've lost one tank. We are almost at the top of the hill. We can see the enemy troops from here. They're moving ahead on the road. Can't you send someone over here? We can't carry these men with us. They are badly wounded." I told the cameraman to tell him that we would try. We, in our Special Forces unit, did not have any medical supplies with us. However, the regiment behind the crossroads had medical supplies, and I expected to be able to get some from them, but I did not reach the crossroads. Halfway there, I met a colonel who was on his way back. He was looking at his hand watch. As I approached, he said, "See what time it is. Do you realize where we are? They'll be here any minute. We got to do something." "What the hell? Who's coming?" I wondered. "Gliders." He answered. "This field, which is right in front of the tanks, is a landing field for gliders. It was supposed to be occupied by ours during the morning. The gliders are on their way now. They'll land just between us and the Germans. I've been trying to contact the command ship for an hour, but I can't get through. The gliders should have left England a long time ago." And then, as in some dramatic action on the stage, before he could finish, "But I got a good idea of what he was telling me. They suddenly appeared from the north. They flew in a beautiful formation of twin-engined airplanes, and behind each of them, high up on the end of a tow cable, like paper kites, carried gliders. We had a dozen smoke bombs as identification signals. I started tearing the label off one pack that said orange and started tossing them into the field by the road. Maybe the pilot would see the colour and head toward us. Smoke billowed out of the checkers like a fairy genie out of a bottle. But it wafted low over the ground, reached for the bushes by the fences, and billowed into the air. It was clear that nothing would come of it. A large formation of transport planes. There were at least 40. 50 of them, in tight link wedges, were bearing down as if on rails. They were travelling at an altitude of 200 or 300 feet, a little above the treetops. As they flew over the road directly opposite us, the leading glider unhooked its tow cable and all the cables following it, which had just been blackening the sky like tightly strung ropes of paper kites, hung free. Now the gliders were flying on their own, and it was here that we knew at last, quite definitely, what was lurking on the hill in front of us. It was no more and no less than a whole battalion of enemy infantry. The whole hilltop suddenly snapped with rifle and machine gun fire directed at the gliders. The battalion had been saving its ammunition, waiting for us, but an invasion of gliders. This it could not withstand. All kinds of weapons were firing on the airborne fleet. The big tug transports all at once gave a lurch, turning back toward England. The gliders seemed to stand still for a second. One of the first planes to turn suddenly went up in smoke. It thundered right over our heads and crashed into the field behind us. A column of black smoke rose to the sky, and the gliders that were coming in for landing fell into this black column of smoke. The glider pilots struggled to find a suitable place to land. They were apparently vaguely aware of what was going on below. The field allotted to them by the plan was exactly the field where our tanks and the enemy 88 mm guns were skirmishing with each other. Under any conditions it was not suitable as a landing field for so many gliders. Only a very few of them could land here. For a few terrifying seconds they cleaved the air above our heads like monstrous birds. Then they crashed into the trees and hedges on either side of us. They tumbled straight onto the road, scraped the ground with their crutches and stopped. The pilots were more skillful in finding more level ground, planned gently, and landed only about 100 yards from the German front line. Our tanks all as one began firing up the hill, and everyone who had a rifle hurried to send a bullet into the woods where the Germans were huddled to somehow lessen the fire that was hitting the helpless gliders. People scrambled out from under the wreckage of the gliders and ran like dazed men. The gliders that landed behind our positions were even worse off than those that had landed in the field, for there was no wide open space, only small clearings between tall wattles, and behind the wattles were mostly orchards. In the midst of all this commotion, one of the gliders, the lead plane, which had fallen behind the others, described a circle and made a perfect landing just in front of the spot where we had discovered the German 88 mm guns. It remained intact. Its passengers got out. We even thought they shook themselves off, threw back the hatch and rolled the jeep out into the field. They travelled several times from the glider to the car for their belongings, which they carefully stowed in the car. Then, as if nothing was going on around them, they got into the car as if nothing had happened, and slowly rolled across the field, then through some break in the wattle, rolled out onto the road, and drove past us completely unperturbed. Everything on the hill was frantically firing at them from the second they landed, but none of them were even scratched. The glider landing battle was over in 10 minutes. No one was controlling it, and there was essentially nothing that could be done. Survivors walked past us, supporting the limping and carrying the wounded. There were more survivors than seemed possible. The commanders began to gather them in the field behind the howitzers. By the time the last gliders landed, it was already dark. The time was nearing midnight. We had been feeling terribly tired for some time and rough, having gathered some of the glider pilots, who in all probability had spent the night before in their own bed, suggested that they carry the guard. We took our tanks back to the crest of the hill, and the last thing I remember from that first day was checking them out in the dark when they came back, and discussing with the commander how to arrange them on 4 sides across our clearing, which was open from everywhere. We arranged them in a circle, like a wagon train in a Wild West movie before the Indians show up. Then I pulled the tarp off the radiator of the car and threw it into the ditch, and I fell asleep before I could even spread it out properly. And then somebody started shaking me and pushing me as hard as they could, and it was 4 hours later, and it was the second day of the invasion. I still had the stove and half a flask of water with me. I made myself some hot coffee. The others had some water too, and I made more coffee for Ralph and the 2 drivers. Then we started the engines, rolled our tanks out onto the road, and they went across the fields, and the fighting started again. The infantry that had appeared the day before had disappeared somewhere during the night, and we had to fight with our own forces, that is, the Special Forces unit under Ruffer's command against a battalion of German infantry, which we now knew was taking cover on the opposite hill. We had forced it during the first day to pull back both its flanks, and had captured or disabled all the field guns that held us under direct fire. The Germans had now let in mortars, which were hitting the crossroads just behind us. This was quite tolerable, for our front was relatively safe in this position, threatened only by rifle and machine gun fire. I did not see anyone hurt by this fire. It was clear, however, that we could not throw the Germans down the hill or break through them, for we were too few in number. Ruff disappeared again. He went to look for someone to let him know how things were going, and I had all the morning to spend in trying to form a shock infantry glider squadron. They had apparently spent the night in the field, whoever had to wherever. Now they were gradually gathering and asking everyone how they could get back to shore. They said they had strict orders to return to England immediately to deliver new shipments of gliders. Few of them smiled to play the part of infantrymen. Most of them had carbines, but they assured me they had never had to fire them. They said they had been handed their weapons just before the flight, and perhaps they had. However, somewhere on the other side of St. Mere-Eagle-Eyes was an entire airborne division that had been cut off now for 30 hours, and there was undoubtedly a great need for our tanks. The only thing that could ensure a breakthrough to them, our tanks, is to let the infantry forward, and with its help to drive the Germans off the hill. The Krauts were not taking any decisive action, but they had, after all, crushed 4 of our tanks the day before when we tried to break past them without infantry. At this time I saw on the road a young, energetic captain who was here as a reconnaissance observer, I think from Corps headquarters. I asked him if he would be willing to take command and lead a rifle chain through the bushes that screen the sections west of us. This hedge seems to go in a circle past that hill where the German is encamped. It is possible that a sudden infantry fire from an unforeseen direction would frighten the Germans into thinking they were surrounded. The captain readily agreed, and I rallied him 60 or 70 men from the loners who had broken away from God knows where, and all the glider pilots I could catch. 6 or 7 of them I had to drag and threaten with the muzzle of a pistol, for they were so eager to carry out the order to return to England. It cannot be said that my improvised infantry acted successfully. After about an hour, a panting captain came running in W. I was at this time trying to direct the action of the tanks and control the fire of the howitzers, and said that he was failing, and the trouble was that he did not know how to lead his chain. At first he tried to go ahead of it, but when he turned around after walking a few hundred yards, he saw that instead of 70 men, only 30 to 35 were moving behind him. The glider pilots, who were most devoted to a sense of duty, had fallen behind and had apparently set out for England on foot. Then he went behind the chain, but after that its vanguard began to get stuck every now and then everyone had to stop. Then he went ahead again, but when he looked back he saw that instead of 35 men he was followed by only 20. Apparently a radical reorganization was needed. By this time I had managed to gather a bunch of straggling lone planers. I considered them my own reserve. I asked the captain how far they had come. He replied that they were nearly round the hill, and that he believed they had not yet been sighted, as no one had fired at them. I sent him back with my resupply. Toward noon our affairs improved a little. The captain showed up again and reported that they had encountered the enemy on the opposite hillside, who had very quickly abandoned the 88 mm horse-drawn gun, taking the castle with them. So then ours took possession of the field gun, without suffering any casualties. When I asked him how many men were involved in this operation, he pointed to a small bunch behind him. There were 12 men there. You could say that our team was not brilliant, but these 12 young men still scored a goal. At this time, Ruff arrived and brought with him a lot of the latest news. We finally found our divisional commander and his entire staff. They were stationed behind the crossroads. His division was not here, however, for the reason that the day before one of his regimental commanders had decided that the Saint Mary Gleis front was in our hands and that the main thrust of the American infantry was going in the direction east of us. That is, between us and the... It was reported that things were going splendidly there. The infantry units are now only a few miles ahead of us. In addition, contact has been made with the missing airborne division. At least its headquarters has landed safely and is 3 miles from us, west of mere regardless about where we thought we'd find it. I went in the car with Ruff, and we caught a council of colonels and generals in the garden. Some sort of car with all sorts of goodies, apparently division headquarters, was being driven across the road to the farm. The stragglers and wounded soldiers were sitting on the ground, leaning against a stone fence near the farm, while 30 or 40 ragged German prisoners, lined up in a line, stood opposite, guarded by a machine gunner. About 2 miles from the crossroads, on the road in the other direction, there was apparently another small battle going on in the town of Chef Dupont. Just as we were beginning to talk with the general, a messenger appeared from somewhere with a radiogram to Colonel Ruff. It appeared to be from Ridgway, commander of the airborne division. He reported that his command post was surrounded, that he had lost many prisoners and wounded, and that he was short of ammunition. Would not Ruff deliver medical supplies and ammunition to him? This put us in the necessity of appealing to our divisional commander, for although we had orders to make our way to Ridgway and to the 32nd Airborne Division, we were at the disposal of the 4th Division when we landed, and its commander had the right to leave us where we were if, in his judgment, it proved necessary. He said to Ruff, "You understand me. I am forced to fight this ridiculous battle here. I am holding in 3 directions at once, and I have no idea what forces I am dealing with or what is going on there." After a moment's silence, he added, "But you do go. I'll try to find someone to take your place, and you go, and try to take some traffic circle way out of the city." Ruff had a quick idea of what we should do. He decided that he would lead the column, and that I should go to the shore as soon as possible, get ammunition and transportation and follow him, and try to catch up with him. Everything was building very soon. Some medical unit was on the road behind us. and while the 4th Division Infantry were getting off Ruff's tanks, we talked the medic on duty into giving us morphine and blood plasma. Ruff took it all with him. He and I, as the reader will recall, had only a single armoured jeep. I went out to an intersection and stopped a brand new car that had just been rolled out of the glider. The chauffeur said it belonged to Major so-and-so, but Major so-and-so wasn't here, and I was a major too, with the advantage of being out in front. I rushed toward the coast in the captured car. Halfway there I got into a crowd. Apparently some headquarters had just landed. Indeed, it was a corps headquarters. At the headquarters they met me very friendly, and with the greatest curiosity asked me what was being done there, and some chief from the supply department lent me two 2.5-ton cars. Each had a chauffeur and an assistant. I took this new transport with me, and we drove further to the shoal. The shoal on that morning of the second day of the invasion was full of vehicles, equipment, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, trucks, all crowded together. But it wasn't hard to get on the road. Without questioning anyone, we made our way through the network of barriers that the military police had already erected, and suddenly found ourselves on the coastal road that ran along the dunes behind the shoal. The shoal was still under fire from concrete firing points farther up the beach, where the infantry could not yet approach. But these guns, which were firing through slits, had a very small vertical angle of fire. They could fire only the very edge of the shoal and a few more feet across the water. Their shells blew up whole fountains of water, and amphibious trucks and landing craft jostled on the water amid these explosions. The whole sky above the shore was dotted with aerostats, and out to sea. Out there toward England, everywhere the eye could reach, ships crowded in, followed by more and more newly arriving ships. There were no signs on the road as to where anything was located on the shore, but the strip of sandbank was so narrow and open that it was easy to find what was needed. The ammunition depot, which had settled first on the sand, now extended to the edge of the road. It was now several acres in extent, and was all crates and cages. Everything had been arranged with the utmost foresight. Corpses were stacked nearby, which was very sensible, for if the warehouse exploded, the dead would not care. While I was pacing back and forth, several more bodies were brought in on stretchers and laid out as they were supposed to be in the training manual. They weren't covered with anything, but the ones being carried out of the big hospital tent across the road were dignified with blankets. The equipment storehouse was in the charge of a sergeant, who was as obliging and prompt as could be. His chief had gone to get new supplies. I only discovered my complete ignorance when the sergeant began to ask me what I needed. In my military experience, there was never a time when I was put to the trouble of getting ammunition for an airborne division. And this, by the way, proves once more that soldiers must be taught everything. My friend the ensign didn't know anything about it either, so we sat down on a box, and I began to ask him what he had, and we both worked out what Ridgway's division might need. Of course, they couldn't have any particularly heavy guns with them. So I bought 75 mm howitzer shells, and the sergeant was very sorry that he could not offer me some with what he thought were much better fuses. Then I got some more mortar mines and grenades. I told him to set aside for me another set of ammunition for the M1 and cartridges for carbines and 4.5-line revolvers. That could always come in handy in combat. He didn't have everything, of course, but he helped my chauffeurs load into the trucks what he could offer us, hoping that the next amphibious truck would replenish his supplies. I suddenly remembered that I had not had anything in my mouth for a long time, so I walked across the road to the hospital, sinking into the sand. Here, too, they welcomed me very cordially and gave me the best of what they had. 2 tins of beans from the commander's ration. I managed to cut myself while opening one of those bloody tins. The duty officer bandaged my arm, and for several days I enjoyed the undeserved fame of being a soldier wounded in battle and remaining at my post. In the large hospital tents lay on stretchers the wounded, silent, concentrated. I don't know what to call the place. It was probably some sort of forward evacuation station. 2 exhausted doctors walked from bunk to bunk, bent over the lying ones, looked at the tags pinned to their clothes and questioned them. Apparently they did not yet have sufficient funds and could not do much. They were probably preparing the wounded for loading onto landing craft heading back to England. The 88mm guns would hit them one more time in the surf lane, and then they would bid farewell to this turmoil forever. After a batch of beans, I was feeling pretty good. It took me most of the day to find the car, the trucks, the road, the depot, and so on, and we headed back in the late afternoon. I took my wagon out on the road, which had been quite deserted when we crossed it the day before. Now for 2 miles, on either side of it, columns of infantry were stuck in the mud. Truly they were almost bogged down here, for they were marching along the very roadsides, which were flooded with tinny water. The road and the water at its very edge were strewn with abandoned lifebuoys. They were strewn everywhere like confetti. On the road itself we came upon a long column of military vehicles travelling at 5 or 6 miles an hour. Beyond the lagoon, where the road branched off, the way cleared, and we moved faster. We took the same road we had taken the first time after landing, through the village where the Germans' fattened corpse lay, to the crossroads, and then Ruff told me which way he would try to go. We turned toward Chef du Pont. We tried to go as fast as we could, but we still had to stop, because enemy mortars were hitting the road, and we were quite explosive this time. After travelling about 2 miles, we caught up with Ruff's rear guard, vehicles from the reconnaissance platoon. We were told that Ruff was moving safely. After we parted company with them, we finally came across a live, genuine sergeant from the 82nd Airborne Division. Ruff had sent him to look for us. It was a strange feeling, running straight across the fields. We felt like a hare being chased by greyhounds. As soon as we got on a paved road, we would look around, and when we were sure that everything was quiet, we would go back to the field and run straight ahead. The roads we travelled on were still German roads. From time to time we heard the sound of bursts, but we could not determine where the shelling was coming from. We tried not to follow Ruff's tracks, but chose another way. We travelled like that for 2 hours. I was sure that we had long since lost the road, when suddenly we found ourselves in a field that seemed unusually extensive for Normandy. At the far end of it stood the large stone structure of a farm. The sergeant said, "They are. Only you'll have to go round in a circle. They might see you in the field, go slowly down the road, or they'll shoot you when they see the dust." A little farther away, we met a ragged parachutist on the road. When he saw the big trucks that were following me, he turned and shouted to his comrades, "Look at that. See, we have reinforcements coming." No doubt they were very pleased to see our trucks, and I did not stop and explain to them that I had only 2 vehicles with me and there was nothing else behind us. When we rounded the field and approached the farm, we saw that it was surrounded by a high stone wall. There were soldiers standing at the gate. One of them pointed to a group to the side and told the chauffeurs to pull the cars back that way, as the engines of our vehicles fell silent. I heard for the first time the continuous crackle of infantry fire somewhere in the distance, on all sides wherever I turned my head. There were the fractional clicks of bursts and individual shots, but it all merged into one continuous crackle. I went through the gate past the soldiers, and here I was presented with a truly amazing sight. A large, dirty yard in which the farmer had probably once kept cattle was covered with people, hundreds of German soldiers and officers, lying and sitting in a completely dishevelled state. Not a single sound came out of the mess. They froze motionless like grey-green water in a sewage pit. Around them sat our desperate young men, all in the mud with submachine guns pointed straight into this cloaca of Germans. Nothing to say, it was a picture. The guys who were guarding the Germans were all wounded and bruised on the descent, so they were all sitting down. But each of them had at least one hand in good condition, in which he held a weapon. The wounded were guarding the prisoners, because the division was short of men, and the able-bodied could not be assigned to guard them. I passed the prisoners and went toward the house, believing it to be Ridgway's headquarters. Not in the house did I see something equally nightmarish. In a large room, with no furnishings except a stove built into the wall, in close rows on the floor, wall to wall, piled on top of each other, arms and legs intertwined, lay severely wounded paratroopers. They were not silent. No, the room was filled with cries as if they were the roars of wounded animals. In the midst of this pile of mutilated people, two French women, apparently a mother and daughter, moved cautiously. One had a cauldron of hot water in her hands and was about to do something with the doctor who stood at the other end. I don't know what the other was doing. They were trying to help. The doctor, seeing me, struggled across the room. He said that Ridgway and his headquarters were in the orchard on the other side of the farm. I told him I'd come with ammunition. He asked if I could take some of the wounded out. I don't know, I said. Why not? Look, he said. There are over 200 of them here. They're all over the house. I'm all out. We're tearing sheets and anything else we can get our hands on. After a moment's silence, he added, we must get some of them out of here by all means. I told him, when they've unloaded the ammunition, if all goes well, I'll come up here with the trucks and we'll see if we can get some out. He looked at me like a man who has finally heard the good news. I left the house and walked back past the prisoners. One of them had risen to his feet and was trying to say something to the guard in German, of course, and with gestures, seemed to be asking permission to go to recuperate. The sentry to whom he was addressing had only one arm in order. He looked at the German with a tempestuous look, leaned forward and pointed a hand machine gun at him. The machine gun was heavy and trembled in his hand. A German officer lying next to this prisoner kicked him in the leg, and other Germans shouted at him to sit down. He crept away from the sentry and knelt down. His neighbour shoved him away in disgust, and silence reigned again. Behind the prisoners was a breach in the wall, and beyond the wall a beautiful orchard, all in bloom, shining in the evening sun. Nothing could be seen in the orchard except one body wrapped in a blanket and a car with a radio antenna in the back under the trees, and opposite, by the fence, stood a group of officers. One of the officers, Ridgway, the other Ruff. Ruff had arrived an hour ago. His tanks were somewhere fighting the Germans already. The Parachute and Airborne Division is reinforced to 10,000 men. Ridgway thought he had 2,500 here now. He didn't know what happened to the rest. He thought they were already lost to us. Perhaps they had scattered in the drop and landed somewhere so far away that there was nothing left to count on. As it turned out, we were wrong. Gradually, over the course of a week, they all joined us little by little. The thing is that their radios were damaged during the drop, and they could not contact us in any way. At this point, however, Ridgway knew that he had only a quarter of his manpower, and many descending into the Normandy hills in the dark were wounded. He was still not quite clear about what was going on around him, but his mood was buoyant and determined. He himself had parachuted down the night before, along with his staff. Most of his staff officers were here, and one of them, the chief of supplies, was eagerly asking what I had brought. We went to the cars. Apparently, the corporal and I proved to be cooperative supply men, because what was needed most here was the 75 mem shells I had brought. The 82nd Division had successfully dropped their light artillery, but they had to stop firing a few hours earlier because all ammunition was exhausted. I have another memory of the 82nd Parachute Division Command post on that second day of the invasion. It was well after I had turned in my ammunition. We were all standing, 10 or 12 of us, in the garden, in the very spot where I had first seen Ridgway, a few feet from the fence with the ditch running under it. We could still hear the rifle and machine gun fire from all sides, coming nearer and nearer. We were standing and talking, and groups of people were coming into the garden from one side or the other. In each group there were 3 or 4 completely frightened Germans, who raised their arms so high that they were trying to reach something in the air, and behind them walked one, sometimes 2, no more a grim, dishevelled parachutist of ours. Grim and dishevelled is the usual look of a parachutist after a night descent into trees and fences. The parachutists seemed very fierce. You could see that they were terribly angry and reluctant to obey the order to bring in prisoners. It was said that the Germans killed the parachutists when they hung from trees, entangled in their slings, or it happened that after releasing them from the slings, the Germans did not take them prisoners, but hanged them on the spot. So our boys, of course, were not averse to dealing with them. It was already late in the evening of this second day. Ruff and his company were certainly doing some things, but they could not bail out the division. Would the rest of the division survive or not? That was the only thought each of us had. Suddenly, in the midst of the incessant clicking of infantry fire, there was a familiar sharp, high, piercing owl, followed by a deafening blow, and very close at that. We were standing under a row of apple trees, and from all these apple trees, as if they were shaken by toddlers, petals, leaves, and branches fell. I saw it over my shoulder, jumping into the ditch by the hedge. Then came 2 more blows, one after the other. As I stuck my helmet out over the ditch, I looked around, I looked right and left, and everywhere there were helmets like mine sticking out of the ditch. And on the ground from which we had so quickly snuck away, there was only one man, the general. He stood all alone, with his head uncovered, and looked down at his headquarters and his guests. He said quite calmly, "It seemed to me that they were shooting at that radio. You know, we ought to tell them to get it out of here. They'll hurt somebody else." In the story, this, of course, does not make a great impression, but, I tell you, it really was a minute. The division was cut off. There were not enough men. No one had no idea what would happen next. All this created such tension that it could break through at any moment, if only the Germans discovered our command post, where the wounded were, and then the commander himself with the headquarters, and all communication. One moment and decision. And all that strength, which is called military spirit, would have shattered like glass thrown against a stone. Of course, it was madness on the part of the commander to stand like that, even without a helmet, while 88 ME shells were exploding all around. But he had to do it, and it was magnificent. Ridgway did it with great tact and dignity, and with real courage. The 88 Mons guns kept firing. Their shells exploded over flight and under flight. After a few more shells rumbled, it became clear that the Germans did not know where we were and were striking by feel. The dangerous moment passed. The game continued. We are here and we will not leave here, I thought. The Overlord will get his way.